Abanom paimi ai alifina hon oklai moyoma ispik bipolaski Jesus pinshali chiyama Jesus pinshali chiyama ichimasid hafinashki Oklai momaka Ispino kaklaski Pinyok chanya takla Ispiyok palaski.
One of the things that brought home to me how serious famine is for a people was the visit I made to Somalia in 1992. The problem there was that fighting warlords were preventing the food from getting to the feeding stations. And we saw rows and rows of people, mothers and often sometimes fathers, holding babies and sometimes children who were probably in their teens and looked like 7 or 8-year-olds starving. And it was a very difficult visit, and I remember the press conference at the end was very emotional for me because I was meeting the press and trying to tell them that this was not acceptable. And so when I learned that Strokestown House, where I'd opened the house itself earlier, because it was a wonderful example of a bad landlord mistreating his tenants, that this same house was going to host and had built a famine museum, I felt that that was a really good way in 1994 to begin the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of An Gorta Mór. Yeah, I was very pleased when I learned that Strokestown House was going to open the Famine Museum.
Famine is a definable disaster, but there are also catastrophes which are less easy to define, and yet which may in the end be just as devastating. The rapid growth of population and the scarcity of jobs has thrown thousands upon thousands of young people onto the roads and waterways and air routes of our shrinking world in search of new opportunities. The fact that they're a dispersed migrant population shouldn't blind us to the reality that they are intensely vulnerable.
I made 3 official visits to Strokestown House. The first was to open the house itself as an example of a landlord who had not treated the tenants well. And I liked that story very much. I thought it was a really important story to know about. And I liked the way the house was done because all the furniture was of the period. They didn't change the carpets. And I remember actually some officials from the Office of Public Works who came down who were critical of the fact that some of the carpets were very worn. And I thought, what are they talking about? This is the authentic furniture, the authentic story of a bad landlord and how he mistreated his tenants. And we needed to know that story from the house where it happened. And then in 1994, I was even more excited that the Famine Museum had been built at the rear of the house as a way of commemorating the Great Famine. I also, after opening the Famine Museum in 1994, I came back, I think about 2 years later, 1996 or so, to open a walled garden. Again, a lovely example of remembering that we had to produce our own food. And that too was an important symbol. I was very conscious, certainly, that it was important to mark this anniversary. But I grew up in County Mayo very conscious of the Great Famine. We were all aware of An Gorta Mór. We were all influenced by it. So it was a natural idea from my point of view, that we would mark very seriously the Great Potato Famine. The 3 years of marking the 150th anniversary were a very big part of my role as president during that time, both in Ireland, but also travelling to Grosse Île, travelling to Australia, travelling to the United States. There were so many memorials, exhibitions to commemorate the Great Famine on Gorta Mór. I remember that year in 1994, I also went to Grosse Île to remember the generosity of the Canadian people, well, really of the Quebecan people, in adopting Irish orphans because their parents had died on the coffin ship, bringing them to Canada. Grosse Île was an extraordinary place to visit.
President Robinson drew parallels between the latter-day tragedy of Grosse Île and the current mass deaths in Africa.
It challenges us to consider not just little Ellen Keane, the 4-year-old child who was the first person to die here in 1847. It challenges us in her name to consider with compassion and anger those other children to whom we can give no name, who are dying today in Rwanda and whom I saw in the camps in Somalia.
Next month, President Robinson will visit the refugee camp of Ngara on the Tanzanian border with Rwanda.
I remember it was a very dull, misty day, which seemed appropriate. In fact, we were told initially we mightn't be able to fly, and I was determined. We had to take a helicopter to get to the island. I said, we're going. I really want to see Grosse Île. And when I heard the stories of the children being able to keep their surname, so that there are a lot of Irish surnames in Quebec from these children who were adopted by Quebecan families, and that the mayor had caught a disease from the ship itself and died. So all of this kind of generosity of spirit towards Irish coming in from a coffin ship with many adults having died en route and children, but some children surviving, and being welcomed, and how important that was. I understand that there are quite a few connections between Strokestown and Grosse Île, that some families went and kept their names and then were able, some of them came back. The Quinn family and the Ty family, I think, were able to come back to Strokestown to complete that circle, if you like. And I think there's a lesson for the world today on migration issues. And we should know that migration has always been part of life, and that we should accept when people are desperate and need to come to a country, that they can be made welcome and that they can benefit from what we've built up, the Refugee Convention, the proper way of treating asylum seekers. Unfortunately, we're turning away from that, which is an enormous tragedy, actually. And quite honestly, we should prepare ourselves for many, many more people having to leave their land because of the climate and nature shocks that we're suffering. I think we can learn these lessons from history.
At my inauguration, I spoke of the 70 million people worldwide who can claim Irish descent. I also committed my presidency to cherishing them, even though at the time I was thinking of doing so in a purely symbolic way. Nevertheless, the simple emblem of a light in the window, for me, and I hope for them, signifies the inextinguishable nature of our love and remembrance on this island for those who leave it behind.
I had been taken aback by how significant for people the light in the window was that I had put at the start of my presidency. In fact, on the night of the election, I'd said I would put a light in the window for all of those who had to leave Ireland over the centuries and over the decades, either because of conflict or because of poverty or because of sexual orientation, whatever reason.
The more I know of these stories, the more it seems to me an added richness of our heritage, that Irishness is not simply territorial. In fact, Irishness as a concept seems to me at its strongest when it reaches out to everyone on this island and shows itself capable of honouring and listening to those whose sense of identity and whose cultural values may be more British than Irish. It can be strengthened again if we turn with open minds and hearts to the array of people outside Ireland, for whom this island is a place of origin.
And that light took on a life of its own. And in 1990, we weren't treating Irish emigrants well. I knew that as a senator. I had visited various centres in Boston, in New York, in the UK, and in Canada, and in Australia over the 20 years when I was a senator. And each time I admired what the centre was doing with no funding from Ireland, no recognition. And so part of my thought was we ought to remember we're a large, inclusive diaspora family. And that was what the candle was about. And in fact, it wasn't a candle in the end, it was a dedicated light with no off switch that we put in the kitchen. And you could see it from the public road, which was a perfect symbol. And I wanted to express the warmth with which I'd been greeted, often saying, we know you put a light in the window, and it's so meaningful to us. It means so much that we're connected back to Ireland. We want that connection, and the light is so significant. Over and over I heard this in my visits to Canada, to Australia, to various parts of the United States, to Argentina, and the same sense of wanting that connection. And that led me to do my second address to the Oireachtas, which is a power I can do as president. And I chose to talk about the Irish diaspora. It was interesting. The subject was quite political as far as the members of the Oireachtas were concerned. And I remember that I made the mistake of being so passionate about the subject, I forgot to have any jokes or any self-deprecation at the start in particular. I just went full in and made my speech. Bang! And I got very tepid applause in the hall. I mean, I remember it well. And my father was in the audience up at the gallery, and he met me after and said, Mary, that was a brilliant speech. And I said, but look, it didn't get any response. And then what happened was it got a huge response from the diaspora. Ted Kennedy put it on the Library of Congress record. I got the most extraordinary letter from an Irish nun in China. She was a teacher of English somewhere in China. She said, I don't think there's a European within 1,000 miles of me, but I have heard that you made a speech and that you have a light on the window and it matters. It was a handwritten letter. I hope it's in my archive, I think it is. But it moved me to think that she had been reached by the speech and by the light in the window. As I say, I believe the light shaped a compelling sense of a diaspora that actually led to very good policies. We have good policies now in relation to supporting migrants and migrant centres and acknowledging the importance of the Irish diaspora, both for Ireland and for the diaspora itself. I first learned about the gift of the Choctaw people to the Irish famine victims when I was president. I was very pleased to have the opportunity to travel to Oklahoma. I had done some homework and I had learned that before 1847, 10 years before, the Choctaw people themselves had been driven from their tribal lands. So they had also suffered the fact that they'd had to leave their lands and where their people were buried, which was a great sorrow. So I felt that there was a point of real communication when the gathering in 1847, the Choctaw people learned, I think we don't know how they learned exactly, about this island far away where the stable crop had failed for the third year, but they understood what that would mean, and they understood famine, and they understood that kind of deprivation. So they raised, I think it's $170 and sent it for the relief of Irish famine victims. And I wanted to thank the Choctaw people for that incredible humanitarian generosity. They didn't know who the people were on this island. They had no connection other than a humanitarian concern. And I felt there was a great lesson for all of us in what the Choctaw people had done, and I wanted to be able to value that. And so when we arrived in Oklahoma, we learned that the Choctaw people were suffering from a terrorist event that had taken place that had killed a number of Choctaw guards who had been guarding the premises. So they had another more current sorrow. And I remember talking about the circle of connection between the suffering in Ireland of An Garta Mór in 1847, the suffering of the Choctaw people who had been driven from their tribal lands, and the connection of being able to thank the Choctaw people on behalf of the people of Ireland, which was, to me, a significant way of acknowledging the importance of the humanitarian generosity that they had shown. I took the trouble to learn some words of Choctaw, and in fact I was made an honorary chieftain of the Choctaw people, which was a great honour, and I got a headdress and a lovely red dress. I remember the warmth of the Choctaw people. I did feel very honoured to be an honorary member of the Choctaw people. It's great to see the way in which the relationship between the Irish people and the Choctaw people has developed over the years. The story has become much better known. The marches take place. In fact, I think it was in 1995, I was honoured by Trinity with an honorary degree, and Archbishop Tutu was honoured on the same day. The ceremony wasn't in Trinity. I think it was maybe in Dublin Castle. But anyway, it was a very important ceremony, and Archbishop Tutu had just come from taking part in the Choctaw March. And I remember him, we were very close even in those days. We became much closer when we became members of the elders together that Nelson Mandela brought together. He was the first chair of the elders. But even then I was close to him. And he said to me, "Mary, it was so cold." And I said, if you know Archbishop Tutu, he sort of, cool. And then he started laughing, and we all started laughing. But what he was describing was the cold that is a wet cold of a march. But the fact that he knew about it and took part in that march before receiving his honorary degree, I thought was an incredible way in which he would talk about that in South Africa, how the story grows, if you like, in people understanding the importance of it. And I'm glad that that has continued, and I was very glad that during COVID, when Irish people learned of other tribes in the United States particularly suffering from COVID, that they contributed, and there was a return gift at that time. I thought that was very moving. I didn't realize when I was thanking the Choctaw people that I'd have another very real personal reason to thank them again, because the story they gave me was extraordinarily important to me when a few months later I became UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in September 1997, and in October I was asked to fulfill another role that I learned that I had as High Commissioner, which was I was the coordinator of the Decade of Indigenous Peoples. And then I was asked to open a very big meeting in Geneva of about 1,000 Indigenous delegates from around the world for the long-running discussion of the possibility of a declaration for Indigenous peoples. I was given a script that was UN speak, full of acronyms. I didn't even understand it myself. And I was supposed to go in and deliver this to open this session. And I said, "Look, I can't do this." And I threw away the script. And I went in and I told that story of the Choctaw people and going to thank them. And it just resonated. And a number of them afterwards called me Mama Mary, which I liked very much. African women often call me Mama Mary, but it was the Indigenous who were the first to do it when I was High Commissioner. And it was a bond that grew over years, and of course it's a great help to me now, where I'm very focused on the climate and nature crisis, because it's the Indigenous wisdom that is the most important, our closeness to nature, that we are in fact nature. If we can understand that, we will learn to tackle the climate and nature crisis. So the gift goes on giving, as far as I'm concerned, of that Indigenous wisdom, but also the wonderful story I was able to tell instead of the UN speak non-speech that I didn't deliver. I thought at the time that I was closing a circle, that it had involved the suffering of the Irish people in An Garta Mór, but before that, 10 years before that, the suffering of the Choctaw people in being moved from their tribal land. We had the opportunity to see their generosity and to acknowledge it and to thank for it. But the circle hasn't closed. The way in which the Choctaw people have become part of our story in a very real way, the way in which it has led to generosity during COVID towards other Indian tribes in the United States, and the ongoing indigenous wisdom that is part of tackling the climate and nature crisis. So to me, their generosity is a gift that goes on giving. The circle is not closed. Somehow it's enlarged and enlarged. And that's the way in which I would describe it now.
Abanom paimi ayali finahon oklai moyoma ispik bipolaski Jesus pinshali chiyama Jesus pinshali chiyama ichimasid hafinaski Oklai momaka ispino kaklaski pinyok chanya takla ispiyok palaski Jesus pinshali chiyama Jesus pinshali chiyama